I can still hear the haunting echoes of that night in Blackwater Forest, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets too dark to share. Started like any other camping trip. Just me and my friends, Sam and Lisa, looking for a break from our city lives. We'd heard stories about this place, the kind that parents tell their kids to keep them out of the woods. But we were too old for campfire tales to scare us, or so we thought. The drive up was uneventful. The kind that makes you wonder if the rumors about a cursed forest could be true. As we set up our tents in a small clearing, the shadows grew long, twisting into grotesque shapes under the setting sun. There was an eerie calm in the air, an almost unnatural stillness that wrapped around us like a shroud. Sam was the first to break the silence, joking about how he half expected to see a headless ghost among the trees. We all laughed, but even then, I noticed how our eyes darted nervously, scanning the tree line as if something unseen was watching. We gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting a warm glow on our faces. The smell of burning wood filled the air, a comforting scent that temporarily warded off the unease creeping into our bones. We took turns telling ghost stories, each more ridiculous than the last, trying to outdo each other's theatrics. The darkness seemed to deepen around us, swallowing the weak glow of our fire and stretching into a void. I could feel it pressing in, a tangible presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then came the sound. At first, it was subtle, almost like the wind rustling through the leaves. But it grew, slowly morphing into something that made my skin crawl. It was a sound that didn't belong in a forest, a guttural growl mingled with a mournful moan, echoing through the trees like a ghost's lament. I looked at Sam and Lisa, trying to gauge their reactions. Lisa's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and disbelief, while Sam's usual bravado seemed to falter. We all heard it, and we all felt the primal fear that came with it. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a drum in the suffocating silence. "Probably just a bear," Sam said, his voice shaky. But we knew better. There was something in that sound that hinted at something more sinister, something unnatural. But none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. We tried to laugh it off, letting the tension slide away with forced chuckles. The night carried on, but the unsettling noise haunted the back of our minds, a sinister melody that refused to be silenced. As the fire began to die down, the forest around us seemed to come alive, whispering its secrets to the wind. The unease grew with each passing moment. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something lurking just beyond the trees. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, shifting and twisting in ways that made me question my own senses. Just as we were about to call it a night, the noise returned. This time, it was louder, echoing through the forest with a ferocity that sent chills down my spine. It was as if whatever creature had made it was closer, presence wrapping around us like a predator stalking its prey. I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread any longer. I stood, flashlight in my hand casting a narrow beam into the darkness. "I'm going to check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Sam and Lisa exchanged nervous glances but nodded, their curiosity and fear mirroring my own. With each step, the night seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with an unnatural chill that cut through the summer warmth. The forest loomed around me, a labyrinth of twisted branches and unseen dangers. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. The beam of the flashlight pierced the darkness, but it offered little comfort. The trees stood like silent sentinels watching my every move. And then I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees, quick and elusive, just outside the reach of the light. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. The noise came again, closer this time, and my blood ran cold. Whatever it was real, and it was out there, lurking in the shadows. I turned back, the forest closing in around me as I retraced my steps to the campsite. Sam and Lisa were waiting, their faces pale in the dim light of the dying fire. "Did you see anything?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, trying to suppress the mounting fear. "Just the woods playing tricks on us," I lied, hoping to convince myself as much as them. But as we settled into our tents that night, The shadows outside seemed to dance with malevolent intent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Forest held its breath, and so did I, waiting for the dawn to break the spell of the night. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew that something in Blackwater Forest was watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that was only the beginning. Morning came with an uneasy calm, as if the forest itself was pretending nothing had happened the night before. The early light trickled through the dense canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that danced over our tents. I emerged from mine, the cool morning air a welcome reprieve from the claustrophobic night. Lisa was already awake, sitting by the remnants of our campfire, poking at the charred wood with a stick. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the lingering fear from last night etched in her expression. Neither of us mentioned the noise or the shadow. It was as if speaking about it would make it more real. Sam, on the other hand, was uncharacteristically quiet. He sat a little ways off, staring into the forest with a distant look in his eyes. It wasn't like him to be so subdued. Normally, he'd be the first to crack a joke or suggest an adventure, but today he seemed lost in a world of his own. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, trying to shake off the tension that had settled over us like a thick fog. He blinked as if snapping out of a trance and forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Had a weird dream, you know? Something about being chased in the woods by, I don't even know what." The mention of being chased sent a shiver down my spine. It was too similar to the unsettling feeling that had crept over me last night. I exchanged a glance with Lisa, who seemed to be thinking the same thing. But again, we said nothing. We wanted to believe it was just a dream, a figment of our imagination. We decided to shake off the night's chill with a hike, hoping the exercise would clear our minds and lift the oppressive mood. Sam was the one who suggested exploring a nearby trail he had found on a map, a barely visible path that supposedly led to an old, abandoned cabin. He seemed oddly fixated on the idea, a spark of his usual enthusiasm returning. "Come on, it'll be fun," he insisted, already packing his backpack. "Besides, you never know what cool stuff we might find in that cabin." Lisa and I hesitated, but the prospect of adventure was tempting, a chance to reclaim the carefree spirit of our trip. We agreed, albeit with a sense of apprehension that lingered like a shadow. As we set off, the forest seemed to close in around us, the path winding through a dense thicket of trees that towered overhead. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, creating an almost perpetual twilight that wrapped around us like a cloak. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, a reminder that we were not alone. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest felt alive, pulsating with an energy that was both alluring and menacing. The sounds of nature were muted, as if even the wildlife knew to steer clear of this place. Every crackle of twigs underfoot, every whisper of wind through the branches, made my heart skip a beat. Sam led the way, his pace quick and determined, as if he was being pulled by some invisible force. We followed, our footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. I tried to make light conversation, break the tension, but my words felt hollow against the weight of the forest's presence. Finally, we reached a clearing where the trees parted like a curtain, revealing the abandoned cabin Sam had spoken of. It stood in the center, shrouded in an aura of decay and neglect. Vines crept up its wooden walls, and the roof sagged as if burdened by the secrets it held within. The place exuded a sinister charm, a relic of times long past. We approached cautiously, the air around us growing colder as we drew nearer. Sam seemed undeterred, already making his way toward the door, but I hesitated. There was something profoundly wrong about the cabin, feeling that tightened around my chest like a vice. "Are we really doing this?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. Before I could answer, Sam disappeared inside, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. Lisa and I exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between us. We couldn't let him go in alone, despite the growing sense of dread. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, a pungent reminder of its abandonment. The dim light filtered through broken windows, casting fractured shadows that danced across the floor. The cabin seemed frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. As we explored, I noticed the walls adorned with strange, crude drawings, faces twisted in agony and symbols that seemed to pulse with malevolence. A shiver ran down my spine, the images etching themselves into my mind. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a corner where a collection of old, tattered books lay strewn across the floor. One lay open, revealing pages filled with scrawled notes about rituals and entities that defied explanation. The words seemed to blur together, ink crawling across the page like a living thing. It was then that I realized Sam was nowhere to be found. Panic flared in my chest as I called out his name, the sound echoing through the empty cabin. Lisa's face mirrored my fear as we searched every corner, every room, but Sam was gone. It was as if the shadows had swallowed him whole. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on us, the cabin holding its breath, as if mocking our frantic effort. Fear was palpable, a living thing that pressed against my skin, threatening to suffocate. We stumbled out into the clearing, the world outside feeling strangely distorted. The forest loomed around us, the trees swaying as if whispering among themselves. We called out again, our voices merging with the wind. There was no response, only the haunting quiet. It was then that I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of Sam or the shadowy figure I had seen the night before. But the forest remained silent, secrets hidden beneath layers of darkness. The realization hit me like a blow. I didn't know where Sam was, and we were miles away from any semblance of safety. Whatever had taken him, it was still out there, lurking in the depths of Blackwater Forest. Lisa clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. What do we do now? I had no answer, only the growing dread that we were in way over our heads. The forest seemed to taunt us, its branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. We had trespassed into a realm that didn't want us, and it was becoming increasingly clear that escape was not as simple as retracing our steps. With every passing moment, the sense of being hunted intensified, as if the forest itself was closing in, sealing us within its clutches. I took a deep breath, the air cold and biting, and forced myself to focus. We couldn't let fear paralyze us. We had to keep moving, find Sam before it was too late. And as we turned back toward the path, the noise came again, echoing through the trees. A haunting reminder that we were not alone, that something in Blackwater Forest was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a sound that chilled me to my core, a sound that promised whatever fate awaited us was beyond anything I had ever imagined. And so we ventured deeper into the unknown, the shadows our only companions, as we braced ourselves for the horrors that lay ahead. The forest felt alive with an unsettling silence as Lisa and I retraced our steps through the dense thicket, desperately searching for Sam. Each step felt like a plunge deeper into a nightmare, the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in from all sides. The path seemed narrower now, more sinister, as if the trees themselves were closing in to swallow us whole. "Sam, where are you?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the trees and fading into the distance. But there was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, mocking our frantic cries. Lisa clung to my side, her face pale and strained as we moved through the labyrinth of shadows. Her grip was like a vice, grounding me against the tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm us both. Despite the dread gnawing at my insides, I tried to project a sense of calm, though I could feel the facade slipping away with each passing second. We were alone in this godforsaken forest, and the realization settled over me like a shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes followed our every move. It was a sensation that crawled beneath my skin, making my heart race and my instincts scream for escape. "Maybe he went back to camp," Lisa suggested, her voice barely a whisper. The doubt lingered between us, thick and suffocating, for we both knew that something was terribly wrong. The forest was changing, morphing into something dark and twisted, each tree an ominous sentinel in this nightmare realm. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, stretching out like a dark tunnel, leading to some unknown terror. Every step felt like a step further from reality and closer to the edge of madness. The strange symbols we'd seen in the cabin haunted my thoughts, their crude shapes burned into my mind. What did they mean? Were they warnings, or something worse? The questions tumbled through my head, unanswered and unyielding, fueling my growing paranoia. And then we heard it. The faint sound of whispers carried on the wind, like a ghostly chorus echoing through the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if the forest itself was speaking to us in a language of fear. "Do you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, trying to pinpoint the source of the eerie voices. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, weaving through the trees with a chilling persistence. The whispers were unintelligible yet hauntingly familiar, a sinister melody that played on the edges of my consciousness. Panic surged through me as I glanced around, searching for any sign of movement among the trees. But the forest remained still, its secrets hidden behind a veil of shadows. The whispers continued, relentless and unnerving, growing louder as if urging us to follow. "Maybe it's some kind of trick?" Lisa suggested, though the fear in her eyes told me she didn't believe it herself. Her words hung in the air, a desperate attempt to rationalize the irrational, cling to some semblance of logic in the face of the unknown. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the unsettling chorus. We pressed on, each step carrying us deeper into the heart of the forest, where the whispers seemed to converge in a dark symphony. The path twisted and turned, leading us through a landscape that felt both foreign and familiar. The forest loomed around us, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging us forward, even as every instinct screamed for us to turn back. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap, that the forest itself was guiding us toward something it wanted us to see. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the oppressive silence. The air grew colder, more suffocating, as if the forest was closing in around us. And then, in the distance, I saw it. Flicker of movement among the trees, barely discernible yet unmistakable. It was as if the shadows themselves had come to life, shifting and twisting with a sinister grace. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to make sense of what I was seeing. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Lisa, my voice trembling. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "What was it?" Couldn't answer. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on us, conjuring phantoms from the darkness to toy with our senses. But deep down, I knew that whatever was out there was real as the dread clawing at my insides. We moved cautiously, our steps hesitant as we navigated the tangled underbrush. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if urging us toward the source of the disturbance. Every step felt like a leap into the unknown, each breath a struggle against the suffocating fear that gripped my chest. The trees parted, revealing a small clearing bathed in an eerie light. It was as if the forest itself had carved out this space, place untouched by time and reason. In the center stood an ancient tree, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like the arms of a monstrous creature. And beneath it, sprawled in the shadows, was Sam. My heart lurched as I raced forward, my mind a whirl of confusion and relief. He lay there, motionless, his eyes closed as if in a deep sleep. But as I drew closer, the sense of wrongness intensified, a visceral certainty that something was terribly amiss. Lisa knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder with a desperate urgency. "Sam, wake up! Please, wake up!" But he didn't stir, his face ashen and still, as if caught in a trance. The whispers surrounded us, a sinister lullaby that seemed to seep into my very bones. I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me, a malevolent presence that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I knelt beside Sam, my hand trembling as I touched his cold skin. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and distant, as if he was seeing something beyond our reality. He mumbled something incoherent, his voice barely a whisper against the growing cacophony. "Damn, can you hear me?" I asked, my voice tinged with desperation. His gaze flickered, struggling to focus on my face, but the shadows lingered in his eyes, deep and unsettling. He murmured again, this time with more clarity, though the words were foreign, a language I couldn't comprehend. And then, with a suddenness that made my blood run cold, his body convulsed violently, as if seized by some unseen force. Lisa and I recoiled in horror as he writhed on the ground, his eyes wide and unseeing. The whispers grew louder, a deafening roar that filled the clearing, drowning out everything else. was as if the forest was alive, its voice a dark symphony of madness and despair. I reached for Sam, my hands shaking as I tried to steady him, but it was like trying to hold on to a shadow. He gasped for air, his body twisting with unnatural contortions, and in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that something had taken hold of him, something beyond our understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it began, convulsions stopped. Sam lay still, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, as the whispers faded into an eerie silence. Forrest watched with bated breath, as if waiting for what would come next. Lisa's voice trembled as she spoke, her words barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. What just happened? I had no answer, only the gnawing certainty that we were in the grip of something far darker and more malevolent than we had imagined. Forest loomed around us, its shadows stretching like fingers of doom, and I knew in my heart that the nightmare was far from over. We had trespassed into a world that defied reason, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred into one. And as I looked at Sam, lying there in the shadows, I realized with a sinking dread, the true horror of Blackwater Forest was just beginning to reveal itself. There was no escape, only the relentless march deeper into the unknown, but the forest's secrets lay waiting to consume us all. As the whispers faded into the oppressive silence of the forest, a sense of impending doom settled over me like a suffocating shroud. The air was thick with an electric charge, the atmosphere pulsing with a malevolent energy that defied explanation. Sam lay motionless at our feet, his shallow breaths the only sign of life in the stillness that surrounded us. I glanced at Lisa, her face etched with fear and confusion. The desperation in her eyes mirrored my own. Silent acknowledgement that we were trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. The ancient tree loomed above us, its gnarled branches reaching out like the twisted arms of some eldritch creature. It felt as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for the next act in this macabre drama to unfold. The oppressive silence was a living thing, pressing in on us from all sides, as if the very air conspired to drive us to madness. "We have to get him back to camp," I said, trying to infuse my voice with a confidence I didn't feel. "Maybe we can figure out what's wrong with him there." Lisa nodded, but her eyes were haunted, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us both. We managed to lift Sam between us, his body limp and unresponsive, and began the arduous trek back to our campsite. Every step felt like a Herculean effort, forest around us shifting and whispering as if it were alive. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before us, winding through the dense underbrush like a snake ready to strike. Shadows clung to us, their whispers growing louder with each step, a sinister symphony that threatened to drown out all rational thought. As we stumbled onward, the oppressive weight of the forest bore down upon me, secrets lurking in every shadow, waiting to be unveiled. I felt a growing sense of unease, a nagging certainty that we were not alone, that something watched us from the depths of the forest's heart. The whispers were relentless, weaving through the trees with an insidious persistence that chilled me to the bone. They were a dark lullaby, a siren song that beckoned us further into the abyss. The more I tried to ignore them, the louder they grew, each murmur a promise of unspeakable horror. With each step, Sam seemed to grow heavier, his weight a burden that threatened to drag us both into the earth. My arms ached with the effort of supporting him, but I dared not let go, not with the forest pressing in around us, like a predator stalking its prey. We reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees parted to reveal our campsite. Something was wrong. The tents were gone, vanished as if they had never existed, leaving only an empty space where our sanctuary once stood. The forest loomed around us, its shadows deepening with every heartbeat. A sense of panic clawed at my insides, the realization that our last tether to reality had been severed. The whispers swirled around us, cacophony of voices that seemed to mock our plight. It was as if the forest had claimed us as its own, drawing us deeper into its tangled embrace. "What happened to our stuff?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling with fear. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent answer. The forest had become a labyrinth, a shifting landscape that defied reason and logic. The familiar path we had taken was gone, replaced by an endless sea of shadows that stretched into eternity. "We need to keep moving," I said, the urgency in my voice masking the growing terror that threatened to consume me. "We have to find a way out of here." But even as I spoke, the whispers grew louder, their malevolent intent unmistakable. They were closing in, the darkness a living entity that sought to swallow us whole. I could feel their presence, a chilling touch that brushed against my skin like the fingers of a phantom. The forest was a maze, paths winding and twisting, leading us deeper into the heart of darkness. Every step was a struggle against the encroaching shadows, each breath a battle against the suffocating fear that threatened to overwhelm us. We pressed onward, driven by a primal instinct to survive. The forest was relentless, its embrace tightening with every step. The whispers were all around us now, a symphony of madness that clawed at the edges of my mind. And then in the distance, I saw it. Flicker of movement among the trees, shadow that darted between the trunks like a specter. My heart pounded in my chest, frantic rhythm that matched the frenetic pace of my thoughts. Whatever it was watching us, waiting for the moment to strike. I turned to Lisa, desperation etched into every line of my face. "We have to run. Now." We staggered forward, forest blurring around us in a dizzying rush. The ground was uneven, treacherous, but we pushed on, driven by a singular need to escape the clutches of whatever hunted us. Sam's weight was a constant reminder of our predicament, a silent testament to the peril that surrounded us. The whispers were relentless, a haunting chorus that dogged our every step. They seemed to come from all directions, closing in with a menacing urgency that defied logic. Forest was alive with their sinister presence, a dark orchestra that played on the strings of our fear. Path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The shadows were all-encompassing, a suffocating shroud that wrapped around us like a cocoon. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, temperature plummeting as if the forest itself had turned against us. And then, in a sudden burst of clarity, I saw it again. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, its form obscured by the darkness. It was as if the shadows had taken shape, a living entity that watched us with a malevolent gaze. Primal fear seized me, the instinct to flee overwhelming in its intensity. I grabbed Lisa's hand, urgency of our situation spurring me into action. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the forest as we raced against the encroaching darkness. The whispers were a constant presence, their voices a sinister accompaniment to our flight. They seemed to taunt us, their words a dark promise of what lay in store if we failed to escape. The forest was alive with their presence, a sentient being that sought to ensnare us in its web of shadows. Our breaths came in ragged gasps, each inhalation a struggle against the oppressive air that pressed down on us from all sides. The path was a blur beneath our feet, a dizzying rush that seemed to stretch into infinity. But no matter how fast we ran, the forest remained one step ahead, its twisted branches reaching out like grasping hands, eager to claim us as its own. The darkness was a living entity, a malevolent force that closed in with relentless persistence. And then, with a suddenness that took my breath away, we stumbled into a clearing, the light breaking through the canopy like a beacon of hope. For a moment, the whispers fell silent, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting just enough for us to catch our breath. But the respite was short-lived, for the clearing held a horror that defied comprehension. In the center stood a figure, its form shrouded in shadows that writhed and twisted like a living thing. Its eyes were dark voids, empty yet filled with an otherworldly presence that pierced through the soul. It was a manifestation of the forest's darkness, a being that existed beyond the bounds of reality. I felt its gaze upon me, cold touch that seemed to seep into my very being. The whispers returned, a deafening roar that filled the clearing with their malevolent intent. They were a chorus of madness, a dark symphony that promised nothing but despair. Lisa clutched my arm, her grip a lifeline against the encroaching terror. Her eyes were wide with fear, the realization of our plight etched into every line of her face. We were caught in the heart of the nightmare, trapped in a realm where reality and darkness converged. The figure moved, its presence a dark shadow that crept closer with each passing moment. I could feel its malevolent intent, primal force that sought to consume us whole. The forest was alive with its presence, a living entity that pulsed with the darkness of its creation. In that moment, I knew there was no escape, no reprieve from the nightmare that surrounded us. We were caught in the grip of the forest's darkness, ensnared by a force beyond comprehension. The realization settled over me like a cold shroud, certainty that there was no salvation from the horrors of Blackwater Forest. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices a cacophony of madness that filled the clearing. They were all around us, a symphony of despair that promised nothing but doom. And then, with a final desperate act, I pulled Lisa close, a last attempt to find solace in the face of the darkness that closed in around us. Forrest watched, shadows stretching like fingers of doom, as the figure loomed closer, its presence a dark promise of what lay beyond the bounds of reality. The darkness swallowed us whole, a relentless tide that consumed everything in its path. And as the whispers faded into the void, the forest was once again silent, secrets hidden beneath a shroud of shadows. In the end, we were nothing more than echoes in the darkness, a memory lost to the night. Forest had claimed us as its own, and in its depths we remained, a testament to the horrors that lay hidden within the heart of Blackwater Forest. I remember the thrill I felt as we drove deeper into the forest, the roads narrowing and the trees pressing in on us like they were trying to swallow the van whole. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend getaway, chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. But as we pulled up to the campsite, an unsettling silence hung in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced menacingly among the trees. My friends and I unloaded the gear, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. There was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the sky above was an unnatural shade of twilight, almost as if it were bruised. "Guys, look at this," Mark called out, his voice echoing oddly in the silence. He was holding up a tattered map he'd found in the van's glove compartment. We all gathered around as he pointed out our location. The map seemed outdated, the trails and landmarks barely visible, like it had been left behind by someone who didn't expect to return. "Maybe this place is just old and forgotten," Sarah suggested, trying to sound reassuring. But her eyes darted nervously towards the darkening woods. We set up the campfire, its crackling flames a comforting contrast to the growing darkness. We joked and laughed as we roasted marshmallows, but the laughter felt hollow, like it was trying too hard to fill the void of the forest's oppressive silence. As the night deepened, the noises began. At first, it was just the distant rustle of leaves, but then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift on the wind. Every time I tried to focus on them, they slipped away, leaving me with an uncomfortable sense of being watched. I could see my friends' faces grow tense, their eyes darting towards the edges of the campfire's glow. "Did you hear that?" Jenny asked, her voice barely a whisper. The rest of us nodded, but no one spoke. The shadows around us seemed to deepen, and the darkness felt heavier, almost like it was pressing in on us. Trying to brush off the creeping anxiety, I suggested a walk to stretch our legs. As we wandered a little way from the campsite, the silence of the forest felt even more intense. It was as if the trees themselves were eavesdropping on our conversation. Every snap of a twig beneath our feet sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. We stumbled upon a clearing where the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie patterns on the ground. That's when I noticed the old, abandoned tent, partially hidden by the underbrush. Looked out of place, like it had been there for years, but somehow it seemed to have been recently disturbed. I hesitated, then walked over to it. Inside, I found remnants that sent a chill down my spine, scratched symbols on the ground, half-burned candles, and a tattered diary with entries about someone being chased. The entries spoke of fear and desperation, and as I read them, a sense of dread settled over me. I grabbed the diary and headed back to camp, my mind racing. "Guys, you need to see this," I said, my voice trembling. The unease among us grew palpable as we examined the diary. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a prank or a random old campsite, but deep down, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As we sat around the dying fire, the forest seemed to close in tighter, darkness thicker, and the whispers, those damn whispers, grew louder. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the gnawing feeling that we weren't alone made my skin crawl. The night was far from over, and the terror that loomed in the darkness was just beginning to reveal itself. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. We huddled around the dying fire, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows on our faces. The diary lay on the ground between us, grim testament to whatever horror had been here before. The air was thick with tension, and every little sound made us jump. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. "I can't take this anymore," Mark said, his voice strained. "I'm going to check out the area a bit more." He grabbed a flashlight and headed off into the darkness. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, our laughter now replaced with nervous murmurs. Minutes passed, and just when I was about to suggest we call it a night, Mark returned, his face pale and eyes wide with something akin to terror. He didn't say anything at first, just tossed the flashlight into the center of the group and sat down heavily. "Mark, what's wrong?" Jenny asked, her voice trembling. Just look for yourselves," finally stammered. We followed him, our breaths visible in the chilly air. He led us back to the clearing where we had found the abandoned tent, but something had changed. The tent was now almost fully visible, and something was painted on the nearby tree, scratched symbols in what looked like dried blood. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light of the flashlight, as if they were alive. I could barely make out some of the shapes. An eye, a twisted figure, and what looked like a crude drawing of a face with a grotesque grin. "What is this?" Sarah's voice cracked. "This isn't right. This doesn't look like something you'd find on a camping trip." We moved closer to the symbols. I noticed something else. A few pieces of old clothing scattered on the ground, their fabric torn and stained. I picked up a shirt, feeling its cold, damp texture. It was a shirt I could swear had been worn recently, despite its state of decay. "Guys, we should go back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place is giving me the creeps." As we made our way back to the campsite, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, following us. The forest seemed to be alive with whispers now, the sound of wind rustling through the trees, almost like faint, mocking laughter. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie patterns on the ground. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Back at camp, we tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it clung to us like a second skin. We talked about our plans for the next day, but no one could ignore the growing sense of foreboding. Couldn't stop thinking about the diary and the symbols. Who had been here before us, and why did it feel like something, or someone, was still lurking in the shadows? "Maybe it's nothing," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe it's just an old campsite someone used for rituals or something." "Yeah, maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. Every time I looked at the tent or the symbols, I felt a gnawing sense of dread. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the darkness deeper and more oppressive. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows outside our tent seemed to shift and move with a life of their own. The fire was now just a smoldering pile of embers, offering no comfort against the encroaching darkness. I could hear my friends' poor breaths coming in shallow, nervous gasps, and the silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional, eerie crack of a branch. I tried to convince myself it was just the effects of the diary and the creepy symbols, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The night was far from over, and whatever was out there, hidden in the darkness, was only just beginning to make its presence known. The hours dragged by, each one heavier than the last. The whispers outside seemed to weave in and out of the wind, growing louder and more insistent. My friends and I huddled together in the tent, trying to convince ourselves that the sounds were just the forest playing tricks on us. But the unease was palpable, thick, suffocating presence that none of us could ignore. At around midnight, the campfire had long since died down to a few smoldering embers, and the tent's fabric felt like a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I shivered despite being bundled in my sleeping bag. I could hear the occasional distant thud, like something heavy falling in the woods, but every time I tried to pinpoint the sound, it vanished. Then came the knocking. At first, it was just a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone was drumming on the trees, but the sound grew louder and more deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get our attention. My heart pounded in my chest as the knocking continued, punctuating the silence of the night. It felt like it was coming from all directions, echoing through the trees and reverberating in my head. "Is anyone else hearing that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Yeah," Mark replied, his face pale in the faint light of the lantern. "I hear it too. It's coming from the trees." We all listened, straining to hear through the growing noise in our heads. The knocking stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie, low moan that seemed to come from the very depths of the forest. The sound was so haunting, so forlorn, that it made my skin crawl. "I'm going to check it out," Mark said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, leaving the rest of us behind. We watched through the tent's mesh window, our breaths fogging up the fabric as we waited in tense silence. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every minute felt like an eternity as we listened for any sign of Mark's return. The knocking had stopped, but the moaning continued, a mournful wail that seemed to grow louder and more insistent. Suddenly, there was a crash outside, followed by a frantic shout. "Mark!" I yelled, scrambling to get out of the tent. I pushed through the fabric, my flashlight swinging wildly as I tried to make sense of the chaos. Outside, the forest was pitch black, trees looming like dark giants. I saw Mark's flashlight lying on the ground, its beam casting erratic shadows. I picked it up and shone it around, trying to find him. "Mark? Where are you?" I called out, my voice echoing through the darkness. The moaning had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that was even more unsettling. My heart raced as I spotted something in the distance, shadows moving among the trees. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the shadows shifted and danced just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. I could see figures darting between the trees, their shapes indistinct and fleeting. "Mark!" I shouted again. There was no response. The fear in my chest tightened into a knot. I turned back towards the tent, hoping to find my friends safe, but they were already out, their faces pale and filled with fear. Suddenly I heard a scream, a blood-curdling, gut-wrenching scream that pierced the silence. It came from deeper in the woods, and the sound of it made my blood run cold. We all ran towards the source, our footsteps pounding on the ground as we pushed through the underbrush. We found Mark lying on the ground, disoriented and gasping for breath. He looked up at us, his eyes wide with terror. "Something's out there," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I saw something." We tried to calm him down, but his panic was contagious. Forest felt alive with malevolent energy, darkness pressing in on us from all sides. The shadows seemed to move closer, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. We stumbled back to the campsite, trying to make sense of what had happened. The whispers had grown louder, almost as if they were mocking us. The shadows outside the tent seemed to grow darker, more sinister. We huddled together, our fear palpable as the night stretched on, each minute dragging by with the crushing weight of the unknown. As dawn approached, we couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The forest, once just a backdrop to our adventure, had become a dark and menacing entity, secrets hidden in the depths of the shadow. The terror of that night was far from over, and we knew that whatever was out there had only just begun to reveal its true nature. As dawn broke, the oppressive darkness of the forest began to lift. But the feeling of dread clung to us like a shroud. The sun's feeble light barely penetrated the thick canopy overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. We huddled together, exhausted and on edge, trying to piece together what had happened during the night. Mark was visibly shaken, his hands still trembling as he recounted what he had seen. It was like a figure, but not quite human. Its eyes, it glowed, and it had this twisted smile. His voice quavered with fear. It was like it was playing with us, leading us deeper into the woods. We tried to make sense of his words, but the sense of menace that had permeated the night lingered. We decided to pack up and leave, desperate to escape the malevolent presence that seemed to pervade the area. As we gathered our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest's silence now an eerie, mocking stillness. As we loaded the last of the equipment into the van, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The symbols we had seen near the abandoned tent were now drawn around our campsite. But they were different, new, more elaborate, and more sinister. The drawings were smeared with what looked like fresh blood, and a new symbol had been added, a grotesque, jagged face that seemed to leer at us. "We need to go." "Now," I said, my voice tight with panic. We piled into the van, our hearts racing as we drove away from the campsite. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, forest closing in on us from all sides. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees made us jump, our nerves frayed and on edge. As we rounded a bend in the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. Standing at the edge of the forest, illuminated by the van's headlights, was a figure. Tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes and that same grotesque grin Mark had described. It stood motionless, watching us as we sped away. We drove in silence, the weight of what we had experienced pressing heavily on us. The figure remained in the rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness, but its presence lingered in our minds, a haunting reminder of the terror we had faced. When we finally reached civilization, we were physically and emotionally drained. We reported the strange occurrences to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a prank or a misunderstanding. The forest, they said, was just a place for people to let their imaginations run wild. But we knew the truth. We had felt the malevolent presence, seen the shadows move, and heard the whispers that seemed to come from the very depths of the forest. The campsite was left behind, but the fear and the memories would never truly fade. As dawn broke, the oppressive darkness of the forest began to lift, but the feeling of dread clung to us like a shroud. The sun's feeble light barely penetrated the thick canopy overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. We huddled together, exhausted and on edge, trying to piece together what had happened during the night. Mark was visibly shaken, his hands still trembling as he recounted what he had seen. It was like a figure, but not quite human. Its eyes, they glowed, and it had this twisted smile. His voice quavered with fear. It was like it was playing with us, leading us deeper into the woods. We tried to make sense of his words, but the sense of menace that had permeated the night lingered. We decided to pack up and leave, desperate to escape the malevolent presence that seemed to pervade the area. As we gathered our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Forest silence now an eerie, mocking stillness. As we loaded the last of the equipment into the van, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The symbols we had seen near the abandoned tent were now drawn around our campsite, but they were different, new, more elaborate, and more sinister. The drawings were smeared with what looked like fresh blood, and a new symbol had been added, a grotesque, jagged face that seemed to leer at us. "We need to go." "Now," I said, my voice tight with panic. We piled into the van, our hearts racing as we drove away from the campsite. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, forest closing in on us from all sides. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees made us jump, our nerves frayed and on edge. As we rounded a bend in the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. Standing at the edge of the forest, illuminated by the van's headlights, was a figure. Tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes and that same grotesque grin Mark had described. It stood motionless, watching us as we sped away. We drove in silence, the weight of what we had experienced pressing heavily on us. The figure remained in the rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness, but its presence lingered in our minds, a haunting reminder of the terror we had faced. When we finally reached civilization, we were physically and emotionally drained. We reported the strange occurrences to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a prank or a misunderstanding. The forest, they said, was just a place for people to let their imaginations run wild. But we knew the truth. We had felt the malevolent presence, seen the shadows move, and heard the whispers that seemed to come from the very depths of the forest. Campsite was left behind, but the fear and the memories would never truly fade. I often wonder about that forest. about the figure with the glowing eyes and the symbols painted in blood. Was it just a figment of our collective fear, or was something truly sinister lurking in those woods? We may have escaped. The darkness of that night, the terror we felt, is something that will stay with us forever. And every time I close my eyes, I can't help but wonder if the forest is still waiting, its shadows ever ready to draw new victims into its nightmarish embrace. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. Decant.